Womanjeka, let's transform eco-anxiety to action. Series 3 of the 2Bays podcast is a collaboration between Regeneration Projects, UN Youth Australia and RMIT University. We acknowledge the two Great Bays, Port Phillip and Western Port, which are known to Melbourne's First Peoples as Nerm and Warmarin or Murrumbik. So we show deep respect to First Nations elders across Australia, past and present, who for over 60,000 years have cared for country with rich ecological knowledge. Their leadership reminds us of our own responsibility as a B Corp and actor in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Getting the narrative right is critical to addressing youth eco-anxiety. And when you do, there's a wave of positive momentum that's created. We're about to deep dive into the power of communication in inspiring organisational change and closing intergenerational relationship gaps. Janet Connor is the Nursing Laboratory Manager in the Diploma and Bachelor of Nursing programs at Holmesglen Tafe. She was also the 2023 Holmesglen Innovation Award winner for an innovative recycling program that has prevented medical waste from entering landfill. Craig Hyde-Smith is a Provisional Psychologist at Blokes Psychology, having completed his Master of Provisional Psychology at the University of Melbourne last year. He's also part of the Wattle Fellowship alumni community. Giorgia McLaughlin is currently studying a Master of Communication right here at RMIT University and co-leading the Eco-Anxiety to Action campaign with Regeneration Projects. In a gum nutshell, younger and older Aussies are having trouble communicating about eco-anxiety, but confronting stigmas and overcoming fear around change will bring us closer together. Learning from successful case studies shines a light on the pathway forward. Womanjeka, welcome. Janet, Craig and Georgia, thanks so much for being here in the studio here on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. Really grateful for you each to be taking time out of your busy days. It feels like spring, or as it is in tadpole season, according to the cooling calendar. It happens to be a busy time of year. So really appreciate that. And one of the things that I thought we'd kick off with this episode is just change it up a little bit and start with just a bit of a grounding check-in practice. I had a message before, because at the time of recording, we had Vasil from UN Youth Australia, who's just landed in New York for the Summit for the Future. And he's just come off a really long flight and he sounds, a little bit weary, as you do. And I said, at UN headquarters, I remember there's a meditation room. Just as a sidestep for a moment, going back into earlier this year, I had the opportunity to visit the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation in Uppsala in Sweden. Now, Dag Hammarskjöld was the second UN Secretary General, and one of the things that he helped set up was this meditation room. So I thought I might just share a little bit about that as a way of connecting this studio space to another beautiful space in New York, another part of the world. And then I thought we'd just check in with how we each are landing here. So when the meditation room was opened, this was 1952. Sometimes they call it a room of quiet. But Hammarskjöld shared this: "We have within us a centre of stillness, surrounded by silence. This house, dedicated to work and debate in the service of peace, should have one room dedicated to silence in the outward sense and stillness in the inner sense. People of many faiths will meet here, and for that reason, none of the symbols to which we are accustomed in our meditation could be used." So it was a really neutral, secular space, a space that people could find, retreat, and gather themselves as they navigate the decision making. And of course, that's where we're heading with this Eco-Anxiety to Action series. So, Georgia, I'm actually come to you first. I know that we've done this a couple of times as part of our collaboration and meetings. Let me go, and then I'll pass back to you. This morning I left home a little bit earlier. it's quite busy at the moment. We're kind of starting to coalesce this campaign. So I thought I'd just take some time. Melbourne's really fortunate to have these beautiful parks, and I went up to the Flagstaff Gardens. There's this gorgeous Moreton Bay fig there, and I've been there a few times, and I think actually the first promo video that we recorded for this series, I was standing there. There's a lady behind me doing Tai Chi, and I'm like, yeah, I need to channel that Tai Chi energy. So I went up there, I just took some time, and it was actually just really nice being in the cool. It's going to be a warmer day today, so being in the cool of that space, having the tree there, and just taking some time. I was still checking a few emails and messages and things, but actually it was just super nice just to stop and pause for a second, because it feels like things are quite busy at the moment, and I'm hearing that from others around me. So that was my way of starting the day. Then I went and got a cup of tea, landed here a little bit earlier, checked in with Liam, and here we are. Last thing that I did was went and saw a cultural space here at RMIT that some of the first peoples and elders have created. So those are some of the ways that I've tried to center myself for today's conversation. We've got a couple of recordings, so that's how I'm arriving. Giorgia, what about you?
So I woke up pretty smoothly, I think, as Melbourne's heating up. I have just found things a little bit easier, and I don't know how to explain that. But yes, as you said, it's a really busy time, and I've gotten to a point recently where I don't even know where to start because there's so many things to get through on my list. But similar to you, when I wake up in the morning, I think I really prioritize getting some sunlight on my face. So yeah, I just had a mug of coffee outside with my cat, and then
What's your cat's name?
Otto.
Otto.
Yeah, I love him so much.
Shout out to Otto if you're listening.
I love you, Otto. Yeah, and then I just took the train over, and then my nonna happened to call, which was even more grounding. And yeah, I just spoke to her about today and the podcast and my feelings towards it, and I'm really excited to be here. It feels like a really beautiful space.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, Giorgia. Craig, down the end, I'm going to come across to you. How are you landing today?
Yeah. So actually this morning, it's funny you were talking about that meditation space at the UN headquarters, because this morning meditation's been a big part of my life for quite a while, like a quite important practice for me. And the other day I was reflecting that I've sort of drifted away from it a little bit over this year. It's quite a busy year for me, so still have a daily practice, but drifted away from it. And so I was reflecting I would like to reconnect to that a little bit more. And so I found I wish I could remember the name, but it's Melbourne Buddhist Society or something like that. They do an online sit at 7 a.m. every morning. You can just join and sort of have a guided meditation in a group. So I joined that for the first time this morning. Oh, awesome. So that was quite nice. Yeah, it was nice to sort of meditate with a group and have a guided meditation, and it was a little bit longer than what I would usually do. So, and that was intentional because I was coming in and doing this podcast today, and it's new for me. So there's a bit of anxiety showing up as well. So I thought it'd be good to sort of try ground myself in the midst of that before I come in. And so yeah, did that, and then had my breakfast, got a coffee, came on in, and here I am. So
yeah, amazing. I hear you about dropping out of rhythm and practice. I feel like I've been saying that for years, if I'm really honest. You know, I still do little things, but as you say, that consistency, like that's something you really got to build up to. But yeah, awesome that you were able to do that this morning. Yeah. What about you, Janet?
Well, work's been a little bit quieter over the last couple of weeks. The diploma students have been on a break, so I've had a bit of catch-up time at work. It's not been quite so busy, and I guess not so many deadlines.
Yeah.
I've also been doing a lot more exercise the last month or so. I've been taking part in a walking challenge, and I'm a little bit competitive. And I actually got off at Richmond today and walked through the gardens.
Oh, good on you.
To get my steps up. So I have found actually that I've just been a lot more, relaxed, alert with the extra exercise over the last few weeks, and sleeping better. So yeah, I'm hoping I keep it up after this challenge finishes. But
yeah, amazing. Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Little bit of competitiveness is
okay. It doesn't.
Hey, thanks everyone for sharing. You know, just taking a couple of minutes to do that and check in. Often we don't have that opportunity. But it's super important. Now that we've checked in, it'd be nice to dive into the topic of today, which is really exploring this opportunity that we have to transform the narrative around youth eco-anxiety. And I'm going to extend that to, I guess, recognizing that we've got two things happening here. We've got perceptions, conversations, narrative around mental health in general. And let's face it, like, you know, we're just generally not great at like confronting things in our society as a culture. Like, we have got stigmas attached to it, tend to suppress it. I know that exists in my family, in friendships groups, in work groups, and so on. Like many others. Then you've got, on the other hand, you've got issues like climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, reconciliation. These tend to create a certain degree of heaviness. But it's so important that we're able to, just like we did, create space for openness and sharing and dialogue, because all of you have these superpowers that we want to show others. Of like, this is how you can do it. This is what changing narrative and communication tools can really look like. So, Jana, I'm going to come to you. We first met, back a few weeks ago, a month or two ago, at Aspire, which is Holmesglen's Tafe's annual conference for staff, and there's a professional development aspect to that, but then there's also this knowledge sharing and relationship building that happens alongside it. And Regeneration Projects was running a couple of Sustainability 101 workshops. Your story came out around what you're doing in the nursing space, and for me it really struck me because the way that you communicated and the way that all of your peers just like locked into your story was really, really powerful. And it just felt like what you're doing and how you're communicating it is such a good precedent for others to follow. So, putting you on the spot, what have you been doing? How did it start? And what are you noticing now a little bit further down the track?
So I'm the nursing lab manager in the Moorabbin campus, and I started in the position just over 6 years ago. I am a former nurse, so I'm very aware of single-use medical equipment and the landfill that it generates. I couldn't see why we couldn't reuse IV lines, syringes, and all the other single-use equipment that we have in our practice labs, because the students aren't working on people, they're working on mannequins or pieces of foam or, not humans. So the equipment doesn't have to necessarily be sterile, it just has to look as if it's sterile. So I started reusing. I've been told it's not recycling, it's reusing the equipment. So the way it's developed is that I put tubs into the labs during the classes. The students, when they're packing up, they put the equipment back into the tubs, and then I wash it, clean it, drain it, and it all gets repacked into autoclave bags, so that when the students then go and use it again, they have to open it as a sterile package. So it looks as if it's sterile, but it's actually not. And this has just developed over the 6 years. COVID sort of threw a spanner in the works a little bit during those couple of years. But generally, we probably reuse 80 to 90% of our single-use equipment. And a syringe can be used, I don't know, hundreds of times until the markings wear off, so then we have to throw it out. But it really has decreased our landfill enormously. And just raised awareness, I think, of the amount of waste that is generated in healthcare, which is unavoidable in most clinical settings because you do need sterility. But in a practice laboratory setting where the students are learning their nursing skills, there's no reason to throw out the equipment, in my opinion. So that's how it's developed.
I'm curious, just mindful that you shared that you've had this industry experience, and during COVID, I mean, we were all using, testing or using masks, and there's a lot of things that everyone, and like I sometimes joke, maybe a little bit darkly, but when we look back in the soil profiles at this time, in 100 or 1,000 years, we'll probably see this time marked by the COVID mask. But I can imagine that's also really hard for nurses and medical, professionals and workers when you're plugged into a system which does have this single-use aspect to it. But then for you to be able to change that inside the system must be incredibly difficult. Is there an anxiety, an eco-anxiety that you've noticed in peers or that you've felt yourself around that issue?
Personally, I have felt it. I do worry about all the plastic and single-use equipment that goes into landfill and the effects on marine life and the soil and everything else. Some of the students are very aware of it, and they do thank me for the stuff that we do at work, and they have come up with some ideas as well. But I'm hoping that it just raises awareness for them for when they do go out into practice, and they can, think twice about some of the things that they do.
Yeah. And that planting of the seed is so powerful, as we know. I'm going to come back to you a little bit later as we progress, because I want to talk about some of the organisational change dynamics, because sometimes that little spark that ignites something bigger can take time, but the simplicity of what you have done is not simple at all. So I want to unpack that a little bit more. Craig, I'm going to come across to you. You work also in the broader medical space in the psychology field. I'm curious, you've been doing some work with Beyond Blue and the Climate Council related to your Wattle Fellowship. I'm really curious, what were you diving into? What were you noticing, and how important was language, narrative, communication in being able to find little ways of moving forward?
Yeah, I was fortunate a couple of years ago as part of the Wattle Fellowship to do some work with Beyond Blue and Climate Council. They had teamed up to do a project to essentially try and get a sense of the mental health toll of natural disasters across the country, and then also they had some questions in their survey around climate anxiety and things like that. So in terms of narrative, I'd actually say that the first part of the project was just listening. It was almost like, what narrative are we hearing from across the country? And out of that narrative, out of all that listening and all the survey, I mean, thousands of people were kind of surveyed and spoken to and interviewed as a part of this project. And it wasn't surprising, the results. Natural disasters have a huge impact on people's mental health, and climate anxiety is really common, and that is a narrative that plays out across research across the globe. Climate anxiety is increasingly common. It doesn't discriminate based on age. I mean, any person of any age can experience climate anxiety, eco-distress, but it does tend to be more prevalent in young people. So I'd say that was the narrative we were hearing, and then part of our work and part of my kind of piece of the puzzle on that project was to then communicate that. So we did some interviews, some radio work. I wrote an article with a mentor of mine, Dr. Grant Blaschke at Uni Melb, and just trying to essentially communicate that, yes, climate change is also a mental health concern and is a mental health issue. And part of my rationale for that is that might give even more reason for people to take action on climate. Maybe you don't care about the planet too much, but you care about mental health. So then let's take some action on climate if you do. So another way of approaching that topic and getting people's buy-in.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were just sharing at the end there, is that some people aren't motivated so much from the environmental perspective, but then when it has a direct and tangible human expression, that's more relatable. Can you just touch on that a little bit more? Because you'll understand that from a psychology perspective.
Yeah, I think everybody's got different motivators and different things that they care about. And some people are just more, the human stories resonate with them more, motivate them more, connect with them more. And I guess I'm of the opinion that it doesn't matter how we get people there, but we just want more people kind of taking action on climate. So it doesn't really matter how we get them there and what story hooks them and brings them along for the journey. It's just about telling enough stories that we get enough people.
Yeah, that critical critical mass. I mean, and just to acknowledge the, the extreme weather events and the disasters and so on, going back to 2019, the climate strikes, which have been such a big catalyst. Soon after, we had the Black Summer bushfires, and people in Gippsland, family members were directly affected, and then throughout Australia there was smoke coming into the city, so everyone was around that. But what you notice is the media really latches onto it, and there's so much fear, and there's all of this stuff that gets pumped in, and one of the things that I notice as a counter to that is like, yes, absolutely, and like horrific some of the impacts. But then fire in general is not all a destructive force. It can be a creative force. And the First Peoples, the way that we understand that, that relationship with country, that control burning, the fire stick farming, books like Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, all these, it shows it in a way that we can actually change that relationship. But we do have these ingrained patterns, which is why, Giorgia, it's so important that we find new ways of communicating. Something that we've been very mindful of in the campaign that we've been creating here is that there is a recognition of the rawness and the toughness of the issue. And we use a phrase like, we get it, like you guys said that so beautifully in the promo video. But then it's like, okay, how do you then create stepping stones towards solutions or recommendations to be able to move forward? So you're studying here, but you've also now, got a wealth of experience. When you look at this space and you think about it from a communications perspective, what do you feel is important? And how are you and the broader team approaching this this campaign?
I really think that the first thing we try to keep at the forefront of our minds is that we cannot let polarization get ahead of us. When you were mentioning the media and needing more narratives to come out, I completely agree. I think that with the school strikes for climate, something I really noticed was it kind of started to feel like it became very like, you're either for climate or you're not, or like, if you go to these strikes, you represent with these people, not those people. I think that's completely untrue, and that's just something that people use to like get a good story out, kind of like clickbait listeners. And it's really important to acknowledge that this is an issue that impacts everyone, and different audiences, different generations, different cultures will all feel it in a different way, but we're really feeling it. So it's important to have as many narratives as possible, as many people involved as possible, and to really practice hearing, not just listening. And I know that sounds really basic, but I find myself a lot as someone in Gen Z, someone who was 18 when the school strikes for climate hit. And I'd speak about my anxieties, and people were listening, but they weren't really processing what I was saying. And I think that fundamental layer of respect is really important. And I think intergenerationally and even between cultures, that's something we could really work on.
Yeah, really well said. And I think that distinction between listening and hearing is critical, because that's what moves us forward, isn't it? It's like that bond that you establish when you feel heard and you've listened. That's critical, because then there's a glue that we can move forward. Without that, there's the distrust and so on that we continue to hear. And I think, one of the things I was just stoked about, I was just reflecting, is like, how great is it to be working with organisations like UN Youth Australia, like a School Strike for Climate, together, and to have just that basic level of trust, because there's just not, isn't there? There's often not. There's a lot of intergenerational distrust because of an increasingly polarised society, which media and all types of other factors are pumping into. So that these narratives of working together, of cooperation, of listening, of hearing, of intersectionality, it's more important than ever, you know. Janet, inside an organisational context, you've got different departments, you've got different hierarchies, you've got different personalities. But over the last 6 years, you've gone on a journey. If you were kind of pulling out some takeaways of what would be most useful for other people, maybe by telling the story of how it's progressed over those 6 years and how you built up to recently, for example, Sustainability Week, maybe it could be a good start there, and let's go backwards.
The Sustainability September, do you mean?
Yes,
that
exactly.
We did?
Sorry, yes, not a week, it was a whole September.
It was a whole month. We formed an environmental working group across all of Holmesglen. We have 6 campuses, 6 or 7, late last year. And so Sustainability September was our first initiative. So for the month of September, we were just trying to raise awareness of sustainability across all the campuses. We sort of aimed at the staff for the first year rather than staff and students. And so we launched it at the Aspire conference at the end of August, which is where you ran the workshops. And then we just had events each week. We had tours. We discovered that different campuses are doing different sustainability initiatives. For the nursing was one of them. There's the hospitality, there's composting, there's different ones at different campuses. But we weren't all aware of it. You know, the other campuses weren't aware of what was going on. So we ran tours for staff to book in and go across and find out what was happening. So we had 4 of those, 1 per week. And they were quite successful and really interesting, really eye-opening. And we had some mend and repair workshops where we organised someone with sewing machines and staff brought along clothes to be mended to sort of, you know, have that reused, don't just throw away and
very cool.
buy new fast fashion. Yeah, so to try and avoid that.
I took my shoes in
really
to get fixed yesterday.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what we used to do when I was growing up. You know, I'm the older generation, older than you guys. But it's gone by the wayside.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of it. So that was really good. So we're hoping to build on that for next year and the following years to make it an annual event. We haven't had a debrief of it yet, but that's next week, I think. So, yeah, it was good. It was good, and I think it did raise awareness with people. So
yeah, and when you kind of go back from that as you've got a working group, you build up to this kind of peak event through the year, something that's really clear and identifiable in your calendar and that has some profile around it. Go back to when you started 6 years ago. What's happened what have you noticed in some of the leadership and organisational cultural elements to kind of see this stuff percolating and bubbling up to the surface?
Well, I think sustainability and care of the environment has become more forefront over the last 6 years. Certainly has in my mind. And the management at Holmesglen have been very supportive of different initiatives. It's now part of the strategic plan for the next 5 years.
There's another narrative to get
sustainability pillar in that. And personally, with what I've done at Holmesglen, I have had a lot of support from my managers, which I probably couldn't have done it without that support. The teaching staff, I had to have the teaching staff on board because they're the ones in the labs with the students. So I've had to, any problems that they've brought up with me, I've had to try and work out solutions with them, and it's taken patience, it's taken flexibility, and it certainly hasn't happened overnight. It's been a slow progress, but we have sort of started small and increased. So I think that was certainly a takeaway for it all.
Yeah, from little things, big things grow, narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah. Giorgia, coming back to you from a branding, a marketing, a promotion perspective, when an organisation like Holmesglen Tafe starts to develop more gravity around sustainability, do you think that comes across as being more attractive to Gen Z?
100%. 100%. Even what you were saying with the sewing machines initiative, I'm starting to see a lot more Gen Z people working in fashion, myself including right now, that are really focusing on, excuse me, on promoting sustainable fashion, or like you're saying, like if I'm going to join and contribute to an organization, I really care about their values and kind of their next steps in what they're doing. I don't like the idea of joining an organization that's a bit stagnant in its ways.
Yeah.
So that's really inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
that what you just shared there, I mean, that's really pertinent. I mean, a lot of the interns, colleagues that we're working on through this campaign and a related app that we're making across RMIT and UniMelb, everyone's now like they're at points where they're either finishing degrees or they're really thinking about work and next steps, and you've got a choice. And that choice is actually really powerful. We've had earlier in the series Maureen from the Young Tourism Network talking about the Workplaces Report. It was really clear, like this stuff shows up in every workplace, every learning place. So if decision makers aren't, hearing this, let's say they're listening to it, but they're not hearing it, very quickly they're going to start to feel friction in the form of losing talent if they're not already quite quitting these types of things. But then those organisations that position themselves, be proactive, and then do the work, not the greenwash, it has rewards. It's got the young people coming through. Hey,
do the work, not the greenwash, is a big one. People are becoming more and more aware, and things are becoming more and more transparent too. So watch out. Yeah.
We've all got devices in the palms of our hands, and it's only one search away, isn't it?
Yeah.
Often it comes up in your face on socials.
Mm-hmm.
Craig, I want to come back to you. At the moment, you're working with Blokes. I notice, two things. One is young guys are disproportionately affected by mental health issues. It's a thing. It's a really big problem. We need to do more about it. I also notice across older generations, they have been taught just not to recognise the feelings, to communicate, to anxiety. What are you talking about? Depression, all of these things. It's taboo, isn't it? So I'm curious, like, how do we do that? We look at Australian government, we look at boards, we look at senior leadership across society, and unfortunately it's still predominantly male dominated. That is changing. We're actually seeing quite a bit of a shift, but it's still male dominated, and they're just bloody stubborn, aren't they? They're a bit stuck in their ways. So what are we going to do to just help them be okay with holding uncomfortable conversations?
It's a big topic. If anyone had the answer to that,
break it down,
they'd be doing very well. But I think, firstly, what you're saying is true. It bears out in what I see in my day-to-day kind of experience, that in general, a lot of guys do find it really hard to open up. And that's not necessarily their fault. It's kind of conditioning, expectations. A lot of guys, as we grow up, we get sent messages that it's not safe, it's not okay to share certain emotions. Other ones might be more culturally acceptable, like anger or aggression or frustration, but other ones like sadness, vulnerability, shame, anxiety in general tend to be harder for guys to share, and that bears out in the research and in what we see in clinical practice. Back to your question of how do we normalize it and make it more okay, I don't think there's one thing. I think part of it is conversations like this, other people being courageous and being willing to kind of open up themselves helps normalize it and send the message, actually, okay, it's okay. I'm not alone in feeling this. So I think being courageous ourselves helps. Any kind of media narrative, Movember does great work. There's a lot of organisations doing work out there to try and break down the stigma within organisations. Organisations themselves can do little things to break down stigma, have mental health check-ins, put posters up. All these little things just help send the message, okay, it's okay for me to be struggling. It's okay for me to open up about that. All of that. I wish I had a silver bullet, but I don't think there is a silver bullet for a wicked problem like this. I don't know. Do you guys have any other thoughts?
I've been reading quite a lot, but this is very much from a communications perspective, about how promoting action is a really good way of also allowing people to process their feelings. Like it creates a space where you have to have that interaction, like say climate change, for example, or maybe directly after a natural disaster. Leaders often promote people in the society that's afflicted to take action, whether it be like clearing the area or helping each other, like transport water from one place to another. And even though that sounds like a really tactile thing to be doing, I've heard that it opens up pathways for oral communication and expression of not just what's happened, but how it's impacted you as a person. Would you say that differs between genders, maybe?
Yeah, I think there's a mental health researcher, a male's mental health researcher that, has this quote, and I might be butchering it, but it's, he's saying that men tend to talk shoulder to shoulder. They're shoulder to shoulder, they're doing something else. They might be watching the footy or playing a game of pool, and they talk shoulder to shoulder. And that's something that I've found with working with men that I have to do sometimes. So I've got an adolescent male in my room, and sitting down opposite somebody they've just met and talking about hard stuff is very uncomfortable,
intimidating,
and not normal,
right?
Very intimidating. So, I'll often be playing games while we talk, or, going out and kicking the soccer ball if, they've provided consent and they're happy to do that. Anything like that helps, have almost a space between us and have an activity that we can sort of focus half our attention on, and then it just kind of makes it a bit easier to open up. So I think that's absolutely right, that doing something with your hands at the same time can make it a bit easier for some guys to then kind of open up. It opens up that it's less intimidating than just sitting opposite someone and having a conversation.
Yeah, it seems like these activities are super important. What do you notice? Nursing perhaps is a profession that, again, is dominated by women in this case, but probably more men starting to come into the space, and that's an upward trend. In terms of navigating these conversations and finding the narratives, but also creating the safe spaces in their different forms, what do you think's important? And maybe how some of those spaces, like how do you create a space where, students might be comfortable talking about more difficult things, but then how that might be different to having the same conversation with a manager or a more senior person?
I don't have a lot of one-on-one with students. So I find that sort of difficult to answer. From what I can observe, they're very aware of mental health, and that is one of their subjects in nursing. It's obviously a big part of people's health. And I think they're very aware of speaking about their feelings. There are more male students than there used to be when I trained. There were few and far between, really. But there's a greater ratio now. It's a tricky one to answer because I'm not really one-on-one with them. But
and what about colleagues? What about colleagues peer to peer when you're talking about these sustainability initiatives and trying to navigate and build that support? Do you see certain motivators being more attractive, maybe regardless of gender, but just to help get things forward and move over the line?
I would like to concentrate more on the effects of the environment on the health of communities, which is very, very relevant to nursing. I mean, nursing is about the health of people and improving that and caring for them. And it's very, very much linked with the environment, with biophilia, with climate change, with what's in our oceans, what's in our water, and all that sort of thing. So I would like to make that link more with the students to just, make it just a bit more legitimate, I guess, and a bit more relevant to what they're studying.
I mean, it almost, my mind's going to, when I hear First Nations elders talk about, caring for country because country will care for you.
Yeah.
And then I hear that in, let's say, the World Health Organization, and there's this One Health narrative, and again, it's this thing. And COVID-19 was a great and horrible example of that, where something that doesn't work in the broader biological community can affect us, and so I think there's something really in this. And when we talk about mental health, we're also talking about, as we've mentioned before, classroom engagement, workplace engagement, productivity, broader economic activity. So as a society, maybe in one ways, and sometimes this is what I notice in men in positions of leadership, is that if it's a business case, or if it's an economic business case, or it's a science, or if it's something else, then they'll be more inclined to listen to it. But I actually think these are excuses in part. I think there's good due diligence, but I think, in fact, it's them showing up. I feel uncomfortable with what you're saying. This is what I know. I'm going to create block, but actually there's an emotional and a mental block. And I think the more that we recognize this as a community and to call it out, and I've worked with people that have done this a lot and over years, and it's been incredibly frustrating as a younger person. And that I see still organizations on trajectories that just feel so behind, But I think we've got to be able to call a spade, because when we put out this, the handbook that's attached to this campaign, Transforming Youth Eco-Anxiety to Action, there's fewer places tied now. And there is a section at the end of that, we talk about the carrot and the stick. And sometimes there's all of these carrots and incentives, but there's also sticks, and there's also legal responsibilities, moral responsibilities that education institutions, that workplaces, but also that government institutions have. And we've seen some examples coming out of the States, for example, where you've got young people actually suing the government because of the impacts of climate change and things like clean air that they're inheriting, which are just not okay. So it's just choose your battle, I think, for young people and for older people. I much prefer the carrot. But I'm noticing that a lot of people that we work with, they just need a stick. So I think young people, to be honest, are going to have to become comfortable using both. Because unfortunately, Janet, not everyone is proactive, in what showing the kind of leadership that you've been part of. Folks, we're going to need to start to wrap up here. It's been a super interesting conversation. We've come at it from different angles. We've talked about, workplaces. We've talked about, what grounds us, makes us stronger. You mentioned that, just one of the things that's coming to my mind, that conversation that you had with your nonna. Listening to elders and what that does to center you.
She's very connected, I think, to her, where she lives.
Yeah.
And she inspires me quite a lot. Like every morning, well, most mornings, she'll call me and tell me about how the sun came up over the mountain and how it makes her feel. It's really beautiful.
It's lovely.
It's nice. Yeah. Well, how about, what if we just started every day like that?
Yeah.
Craig, you must work with so many different people, and giving tips to young people around navigating their own eco-anxiety has got to be in the toolkit. What's one of your tools that you say, here, have a go at this?
I think there's so much that can help. And so there's probably not one tool that I go to. It's going to depend on the person sitting in front of me and, what they are saying works for them. But I can speak from my own experience. One thing that really helps me is, as you were just talking about, like connection to nature, just spending time in nature, whether it's out in my backyard looking at my veggies or out on a hike. The research is pretty clear that spending time with nature is good for our mental health. It's good for eco-anxiety. And there's some really interesting research out there that shows that a person's connection to nature is one of the strongest predictors of pro-environmental behaviour. So if we're talking about how do we get people to care more about the planet, I don't know how you actually do this in practice, but if we could get the people in leadership positions to spend more time just sitting with nature, connecting to nature, that might lead to them actually taking more action. So I think that's a really interesting approach that I've been thinking about recently, of like, let nature do its thing, like put them out there and let nature convince them why it's important to protect it. Is a line of thinking that I've been going down recently. I don't know quite how that would actually work, but I think it's an interesting question to ask ourselves.
I've got to get you to have a look at the new 2Bays app that we're making. Yeah. And it's got some things that are just like that. It's got them beautiful soundscapes set in different waterways around Melbourne. It's just like dropping in 10 minutes, but it's about showing the things that are already in our backyards, you know.
Yeah.
There's also quite a lot of evidence to show that being in nature is good for physical health as well as mental health. And if you've got a hospital and you've got patients who can access nature, even just looking out onto blue sky and trees, hear birds, it can have quite an effect on pain management, on blood pressure, on all sorts of things as well. So it's not just mental health, it's physical health as well. Yeah. It's really interesting.
Sounds like a tip for workplaces to bring more nature into their...
Absolutely. And wellness gardens in hospitals or anywhere. Wellness gardens are great, where you can just go and sit for 5 minutes and be in nature. Yeah.
Well, it makes sense.
Just looking at a beautiful tree. Yeah. I mean, there's some gorgeous trees around here.
As a species, we evolved in that environment. Our brains, our bodies evolved to be intimately connected with nature because our survival depended on it. Yeah. And now, from an evolutionary standpoint, our modern world is very, very new, and our brains haven't updated yet. We've still got this old school software or hardware, so to speak. So it makes sense that being around nature does something to us. And there's some very interesting research exploring why. Like, why does nature connection have all these mental and physical health benefits? Like, what's the mechanism underneath it? So,
Giorgia, going back to your nonna, what would your nonna say to, let's say, some of those decision makers that are in our society that are, they're finding it hard. They know that there's an issue. There's actually the willingness to move. They do need some more tools in their hands and they need solutions. But what do you think she'd say in helping them to overcome that mental, emotional barrier?
There's the nonna I know and there's the nonna other people know. So she can be very direct. But I think she would say that, she said this to me, that something's been lost. That, similar to what you were saying, it is natural for us to kind of give to the land because it gives back to us. And I think that comes from, obviously, like First Nations perspectives. She's not Indigenous, but I think growing up on a farm, staying on the farm her whole life, she's always felt this connection to the land. And when I talk to her about my life, sometimes she always says, something's been lost. And I think she could say that to those leaders as well. And I think you always have to present people with an action that will benefit them, ultimately. And I know that sounds a little bit hedonistic, but it'll benefit everyone else as well if they feel that connection to nature too. And if they see how, spending, what were you saying with, I don't know how, but if we get these leaders to spend more time out in nature.
Yeah, it was just this, some, studies that have been done that showing somebody's connection to nature. And I think that might be their subjective, like their perceived connection to nature is a strong predictor of pro-environmental behaviours. Yeah.
Sorry.
So,
I just think that if they saw how that would benefit them, they would be more likely to do that.
Yeah.
Regeneration Projects is fortunate to be participating in the Global Nature Positive Summit taking place in Sydney this October. And one of the lines in a presentation that I'll give about some of our Stonewall Cities work is that we believe that a nature positive future starts with a positive relationship with nature. And I think the walking that you're doing, that sunrise type imagery, the meditation that you're doing, all of those are gateways into that positive relationship. But there's a reconnection story that's going on here. And I think you're right. I think there's a generational loss. So maybe it's actually going back to our own childhood memories, or going back to our own ancestry a little bit and looking for those points of connection, because that is our own story. There is a bit of self-interest there, and it's also just interesting.
Yeah.
There's some juicy stuff in family histories and heritage. Folks, we're going to have to wrap up there. Janet, Giorgia and Craig, thank you so much for being here and sharing your perspectives. We're certainly doing this, we hope, by example with this campaign around transforming eco-anxiety to action, but there is more work to do and we need everyone to chip in. Folks, Nungujin, thank you for tuning in to the 2Bays podcast. This 2Bays series, Transforming Eco-Anxiety to Action, is part of Regeneration Projects' ongoing work in building young Australians' ecological literacy, leadership and entrepreneurship skills. If you're an educator, employer, decision maker or a young person passionate about positive change, go to our new website, 2bays.earth, to discover our new app, educational workshops and capacity building programs. Folks, that's a wrap. Thanks to our series partners, UN Youth Australia and RMIT University, special guests, researching, advocating and innovating solutions, and listeners. Remember, subscribe to 2Bays on your favourite podcast platform and Instagram. My name is Matt, and on behalf of Regeneration Projects, Nungojin, thank you for tuning in and see you on the next episode of the 2Bays podcast.